Welcome back to the Jamestown settlement in Virginia, where today we're going to explore the history of a ship called the Treasurer. This ship appears multiple times in the historical record, most notably when reading about Pocahontas' capture by Samuel Argall in 1613, her subsequent trip to England with her husband John Rolfe and son Thomas in 1616, and the transportation of the first Africans to the colony in 1619. At first glance, the name of a ship might not seem like an important detail, but looking closer into the documents around this ship tells us a much more complex story that winds through a lot of Jamestown's early history. Today, we are going to use the story of the Treasurer to demonstrate how historians compile different sources of information to present a more complete history of a person or topic, while considering the potential inconsistencies and missing information that has not yet been discovered. Starting with primary sources, or first-hand documents from the period we are studying, we have a set of musters, or inventories of people living in households, from the 1620s. Multiple people listed on these musters are documented as arriving in Virginia on a ship called the Treasurer between the years 1613 and 1618. The next primary documents we have are writings by people in Jamestown themselves, including letters and journals from people like Samuel Argall, who was a co-owner and at one point captain of the Treasurer. Another source we have is administrative records from England that list when ships arrived and departed from port. The final set of primary sources we will discuss today are court documents, including witness testimonies, the matters that were investigated, and the charges filed. In a perfect world, all of these sources would align completely with each other and confirm what we know about a topic. However, even with the ship as well documented for the period as the Treasurer, there are multiple inconsistencies and even contradictions between these sources. For example, let's look at the case of the colonists listed as arriving on the Treasurer in the 1624 musters. Some of the years that people say they arrived in Virginia are times when we have other official records that prove that the ship is back in England at this time. So what could be going on here? In his article, Early Passengers to Virginia, When Did They Really Arrive?, Dr. Avery E. Kolb has given us some ideas. Kolb outlines why these inconsistencies may be so pervasive: transcription errors, the transition from the Julian to Gregorian calendar, or simply misremembering by the people who came to the colony at a young age, recalling their arrival date years after the fact, or even recalling their departure date from England instead of when they arrived in Virginia. Another issue that Kolb doesn't necessarily mention in this article, but something he is most certainly aware of, is when looking at the names of ships, some of the most common issues arise because ship names tended to be reused, and even then, multiple ships could exist at the same time and share a name. Today, we don't necessarily have a simple way to distinguish them between one another. Once we understand how some of these problems arose, Kolb then seeks to rectify them as best he can by using other primary sources like Virginia Company records to confirm arrival and departure dates for ships, as well as re-examining the primary documents themselves to see if information was potentially transcribed incorrectly. Thanks to the work of a fellow historian, we can already gain a large amount of clarity concerning when people are arriving on the Treasurer in Virginia and how many there are. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but Kolb has given us the tools to continue this work in other areas. This article is a great example of a secondary source, or a document that clarifies information and documents from the past and interpolates them for others. Other times, putting together different sources can feel like putting pieces of a puzzle together to create a bigger picture. Let's look at one of the most pivotal moments in the Treasurer's history, the transportation of the first Africans to the colony of Virginia. When we look at English sources that discuss this event, we have a couple of options. One is the testimony of those involved in financial claims made in the courts of Westminster, specifically the 1622 case of Buckingham versus Argall. By comparing the statements of all of the men interviewed, a clearer picture begins to emerge of what the crew of the Treasurer's intentions were once it arrived at the colony. According to John Martin, who was aboard the Treasurer on its journey from England to Virginia in 1618, once the ship arrived in Virginia, it left to go to the West Indies and did not return to the colony until 10 months later. John Salmon says he rode aboard the Treasurer in 1618 from Virginia to Bermuda, but disembarked there and did not continue with the ship. Edward Brewster is even more bold, and outright states that the Treasurer is in the West Indies, quote, to rob the King of Spain by the taking of a ship which was brought to Virginia, unquote. It should be noted, though, that based on other statements made in this court case, Edward Brewster in particular seems to have been significant rivals with Samuel Argall, a potential motivating factor to expose or overstate Argall's wrongdoings. All of these statements alone may not mean much, but together they tell us that at the very least, the ship was notably absent from the colony shortly after it arrived, and its departure was sanctioned by Samuel Argall, the governor of the colony at the time, and at this point, the former captain of the Treasurer. Earlier in 1620, Nathaniel Rich drafted a statement preparing to defend his relative, the Earl of Warwick, a co-owner of the treasure, in front of the Privy Council, or advisors to the king, in London. In this letter, he acknowledges the attempted cover-up of the Earl of Warwick's connection with the treasure, but does not deny said connection. Instead, he blames Sir Edwin Sandys, treasurer of the Virginia Company, for not approaching the Earl of Warwick about the treasurer's piratical activities and instead publicizing them to other members of the company and ambassadors to Spain, whose ships had been attacked. Rich takes the path of admitting the truth of the matter through not taking offense with the accusations of piracy themselves, but the exposure of evidence against his relative in such a public manner without being given the chance to cover up their wrongdoings. By comparing both documents, we can conclude that whatever the treasurer was doing, it probably wasn't exactly legal, considering nobody seems to want to openly admit exactly what the ship was up to during those 10 months. To get to more of the whole picture, we must once again turn to our trusty secondary sources. Many documents of this age and importance are not accessible online and can only be accessed in person through archives. However, many museums like ours can take advantage of experts who have studied the primary documents we may not have access to. In the case of what the treasurer is doing in 1619, the documents from the High Court of Admiralty charged with investigating the matter are in England. Historian Martha W. McCartney examined these documents and compiled her findings into an article written in collaboration with the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation in 2019. McCartney was able to uncover within these documents the statements of not just colonists in Jamestown, but people like John Wood, the navigator aboard the treasurer, and Nathaniel Butler, the governor of the Bermuda colony. Their statements, along with others from the court records, tell us that the treasurer was, in fact, engaging in piracy during this period. Not only this, but the men testified that they took about 30 African prisoners from the ship that they attacked, and they transported those Africans aboard the treasure to the Virginia colony. Witnesses in Bermuda, including Nathaniel Butler, state that about 25 Africans were brought there in September of 1619. John Wood says that when the treasurer docked earlier in Virginia, approximately, quote, 2 or 3, unquote, Africans were transported ashore. 5 other unnamed witnesses also give us a crucial piece of testimony that provides a rather definitive end to the treasurer's time on the sea. They state that as of February of 1620, the treasurer was docked at a warehouse in St. George's Town, and it was, quote, so weather-beaten and torn as never like to put to sea again, unquote. Nathaniel Butler's testimony also states that he had the ordnances and crew of the treasurer removed to shore, and the ship was brought to a creek, where it was, quote, overset and sunk in the water past all recovery, unquote. The other piece of information we have that confirms this testimony brings us all the way back to the 1624 musters, where there is a woman named Angelo listed. She is listed as an African woman arriving in Virginia aboard the treasurer. As there are no records of any other Africans being brought to the colony of Virginia between 1619 and 1624, her presence in the colony is living proof of the actions taken by the crew of the treasurer. Even though we don't know much more about her personal story, we can acknowledge what her experience may have been and the events that led up to it. To conclude, the road to a complete story when studying history is almost never straightforward, but by recognizing the potential challenges, we can overcome them more effectively and gain a better understanding of what life was really like for people in the past. Research can be overwhelming and intimidating sometimes, whether it's because of the amount or lack of information. Experiment with how you are organizing that information, in a timeline, as a bullet list, through quotes from sources, or just writing things down in a notebook that you find interesting. Talk to peers or classmates about questions you have and think about what you think is the most likely scenario. Imagine what you would do in the situations in which people from history find themselves. Try to remember that even today, we don't have all the answers about our world, but we should never stop asking questions to better understand it. Thanks again for watching the video this week. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel below. If you want to know more about any of the subjects we discussed today, let us know, and be sure to drop a comment telling us your favorite way to learn about the past. See you next time!